Chapter 26 of Jock of the Bushveld. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Susie S.A., Hermanus, South Africa, March 2010. Jock of the Bushveld by Sir Percy Fitzpatrick. Chapter 26. Our Various Ways. When the trip was squared off and the boys paid, there was nothing left. Jim went home with wagons returning to Spitzkop, once more for the last time grievously hurt in dignity because his money was handed to my friend, the owner of the wagon, to be paid out to him when he reached his kraal. But his gloomy resentment melted as I handed over to him things for which there was no further need. The wagons moved off, and Jim with them, but twice he broke back again to dance and shout his gratitude, for it was wealth to him to have the riems and voorslag, the odd yokes and strops and wagon tools, the baking pot and pan and billies, and they were little to me when all else was gone. And Jim, with all his faults, had earned some title to remembrance for his loyalty. My way had been his way, and the hardest day had never been too hard for him. He had seen it all through to the finish, without a grumble and without a shirk. His last shout, like the bellow of a bull, was an uproarious good-bye to Jock, and Jock seemed to know it was something of an occasion, for as he stood before me looking down the road at the receding wagons and at the dancing figure of Jim, his ears were cocked, his head was tilted a little sideways, and his tail stirred gently. It was at least a friendly nod in return. A couple of weeks later I heard from my friend. "You will be interested to hear that lunatic of yours reached his kraal all right, but that's not his fault. He is a holy terror. I have never known such a restless animal. He is like a change in the weather. You seem to feel him everywhere, upsetting everything and everyone the whole time. I suppose you hammered him into his place and kept him there, but I wouldn't have him at a gift. It is not that there was anything really wrong, only there was no rest, no peace. But he's a gay fighter. That was a treat. I never laughed so much in my life. Below the Devil's Kantoor we met a lot of wagons from Lydenburg, and he had a row with one of the drivers, a lanky nigger with dandy patched clothes. The boy wouldn't fight, just yelled blue murder while Jim walloped him. I heard the yells and the whacks like the beating of carpets, and that was Jim laying it on all over him, legs, hands, back and arms, with a sort of ferocious satisfaction, every whack being accompanied by a husky suppressed shout, "Fight, Shangaan! Fight!" But the other fellow was not on for fighting. He floundered about, yelled for mercy and help, and tried to run away. But Jim simply played round him. One spring put him alongside each time. I felt sorry for the long nigger and was going to interfere and save him, but just then one of his pals called out to their gang to come along and help, and ran for his sticks. It was rare fun then. Jim dropped the patched fellow and went like a charging lion straight for the wagons where the gang were swarming for their sticks, letting out right and left whenever he saw a nigger, whether they wanted fight or not, and in about 5 seconds the whole lot were headed for the bush, with Jim in full chase. Goodness knows what the row was about. As far as I can make out from your heathen, it is because the other boy is a Shangaan and reads the Bible. Jim says this boy, Sam is his name, worked for you and ran away. Sam says it is not true, and that he never heard of you, and that Jim is a stranger to him. There's something wrong in this, though, because when the row began, Sam first tried to pacify your lunatic, and I heard him sing out in answer to the first few licks, "Gashle, unganam! Gashle, makokel!" Gently, friend, gently, makokel. "Wow, makokela! Ua bulala mena!" "Wow, makokela, you will kill me!" He knew Jim right enough, that was evident, but it didn't help him. He had to skip for it all the same. I was glad to pay the noble Jim off and drop him at his kraal. Sam was laid up when we left. It is better to skip the change from the old life to the new. When the luck, as we called it, was all out, when each straw seemed the last for the camel's breaking back, and there was always still another to come. But the turn came at last, and the long arm of coincidence reached out to make the impossible a matter of fact. It is better to skip all that, for it is not the story of Jock. and it concerns him only so far that in the end it made our parting unavoidable. When the turn did come it was strange, and at times almost bewildering, to realize that the things one had struggled hardest against and regarded as the worst of luck were blessings in disguise, and were all for the best. So the new life began, and the old one was put away. But the new life, for all its brighter and wider outlook and work of another class, for all the charm that makes Barberton now a cherished memory to all those who knew the early days, was not all happy. The new life has its hours of darkness too, of almost unbearable trek fever, of restless, sleepless longing for the old life, of homesickness for the veldt, the freedom, the roaming, the nights by the fire and the days in the bush. Now and again would come a sleepless night with its endless procession of scenes, in which some remembered from the past were interlinked with others imagined for the future, and here and there, in these long waking dreams, came stabs of memory, flashes of lightning vividness, the head and staring eyes of the kudu bull, as we had stood for a portion of a second face to face, the yawning mouth of the maddened crocodile, the mamba and its beady hateful eyes, as it swept before the bushfire. And there were others too that struck another chord, the cattle, the poor dumb beasts that had worked and died, stepping stones in a man's career, the books and chalk and blackboard of the school, used, discarded, and forgotten. No, they were not forgotten, and the memory of the last track was one long mute reproach on their behalf. They had paved the roadway for the Juggernaut man. All that was left of the old life was Jock, and soon there was no place for him. He could not always be with me, and when left behind he was miserable, leading a life that was utterly strange to him, without interest and among strangers. While I was in Barberton he accompanied me everywhere, but, absurd it seems, there was a constant danger for him there, greater though less glorious than those that he faced so lightly in the veldt. His deafness, which passed almost unnoticed and did not seem to handicap him at all in the veldt, became a serious danger in camp. For a long time he had been unable to hear a sound, but he could feel sounds, that is to say, he was quick to notice anything that caused a vibration. In the early days of his deafness I had been worried by the thought that he would be run over while lying asleep near or under the waggons, and the boys were always on the lookout to stir him up, but we soon found that this was not necessary. At the first movement he would feel the vibration and jump up. Jim realized this well enough, for when wishing to direct his attention to the strange dogs or shungans, the villain could always dodge me by stamping or hammering on the ground, and Jock always looked up. He seemed to know the difference between the sounds he could ignore, such as chopping wood, and those he ought to notice. In camp, Barberton in those days was reckoned a mining camp and was always referred to as camp. The danger was due to the number of sounds. He would stand behind me as I stopped in the street, and sometimes lie down and snooze if the wait was a long one, and the poor old fellow must have thought it a sad falling off, a weary, monotonous change from the real life of the veldt. At first he was very watchful, and every rumbling wheel or horse's footfall drew his alert little eyes round to the danger point, but the traffic and noise were almost continuous, and one sound ran into another, and thus he became careless or puzzled, and on several occasions had narrowly escaped being run over or trodden on. Once, in desperation after a bad scare, I tried chaining him up, and although his injured reproachful look hurt, it did not weaken me. I had hardened my heart to do it, and it was for his own sake. At lunch-time he was still squatting at the full length of the chain, off the mat and straw, and with his head hanging in the most hopeless dejected attitude one could imagine. It was too much for me. The dog really felt it, and when I released him there was no rejoicing in his freedom. As the hated collar and chain dropped off, he turned from me without a sign or sound of any sort, and walked off slowly, lay down some 10 yards away, with his head resting on his paw. He went to think, not to sleep. I felt abominably guilty, and was conscious of wanting to make up for it all the afternoon. Once I took him out to Fig Tree Creek 15 miles away, and left him with a prospective friend, at whose camp in the hills it seemed he would be much better off and much happier. When I got back to Barberton that night he was waiting for me, with a tag of chewed rope hanging round his neck, not the least ashamed of himself, but openly rejoicing in the meeting, and evidently never doubting that I was equally pleased. And he was quite right there. But it could not go on. One day, as he lay asleep behind me, a loaded waggon coming sharply round a corner as nearly as possible passed over him. The wheel was within inches of his back as he lay asleep in the sand. There was no chance to grab. It was a rush and a kick that saved him, and he rolled over under the waggon and found his own way out between the wheels. A few days after this Ted passed through Barberton, and I handed Jock over to him to keep and care for until I had a better and safer home for him. One day, some 2 years later, there turned up at my quarters an old friend of the transport days, Harry Williams. He had been away on a long track up north to look for some supposed mine of fabulous richness, of which there had been vague and secret reports from natives. He stayed with me for some days, and one evening, after the bout of fever and ague had passed off, and rest and good feeding had begun to pull him round, he told us a story of their search. It was a trip of much adventure, but it was the end of his story that interested me most, and that is all that needs be told here. They had failed to find the mine. The native who was supposed to know all about it had deserted, with all he could carry off. They were short of food and money and out of medicines. The delays had been great. They were 200 miles from any white man. There was no road but their own erratic track through the bush. The rains had begun and the fever season set in. The cattle, they had one waggon and span, were worn out, the fever had gripped them, and of the 6 white men 3 were dead, 1 dying, and 2 only able to crawl. Most of their boys had deserted. 1 umfaan fit for work, and the driver, then delirious with fever, completed the party. The long journey was almost over, and there were only a few treks from the store and camp for which they were making. But they were so stricken and helpless it seemed as though that little was too much, and they must die within reach of help. The driver, a big Zulu, was then raving mad. He had twice run off into the bush and been lost for hours. Precious time and waning strength were spent in the search, and with infinite effort and much good luck they had found him and induced him to return. On the second occasion they had enticed him onto the waggon, and, as he lay half unconscious between bursts of delirium, had tied him down flat on his back, with wrists and ankles fastened to the buck rails. It was all they could do to save him. They had barely strength to climb up and pour water into his mouth from time to time. It was midday then, and their dying comrade was so far gone that they decided to abandon one track and wait for evening, to allow him to die in peace. Later on, when they thought it was all over, they tried to scrape out a grave for him, and began to pull out one old blanket to wrap round him in place of a shroud and coffin. It was then that the man opened his eyes and faintly shook his head. So they inspanned as best they could and made another track. I met the man some years afterwards, and he told me he had heard all they said, but could only remember one thing, and that was Harry's remark, that 2 gin cases were not enough for a coffin, so they would have to take one of the blankets instead. In the morning they went on again. It was then at most 2 treks more to their destination, but they were too weak to work or walk, and the cattle were left to crawl along undriven. But after half an hour's tracking they reached a bad drift where the waggon stuck. The cattle would not face the pull. The 2 tottering, trembling white men did their best, but neither had strength to use the whip. The umfaan led the oxen this way and that, but there was no more effort in them. The water had given out, and the despairing, helpless men saw death from thirst awaiting them within a few hours' track of help, and to add to the horror of it all, the Zulu driver, with thirst aggravating his delirium, was a raving lunatic, struggling and wrenching at his bonds until the waggon rattled, and uttering maniac yells, and gabbling incessantly. Hours had gone by in hopeless effort, but the oxen stood out at all angles, and no 2 would pull together in answer to the feeble efforts of the fainting men. Then there came a lull in the shouts from the waggon, and in answer to the little voorloper's warning shout, "Pas op, baas!" (Look out, master!), the white men looked round and saw the Zulu driver up on his knees freeing himself from the rheims. In another moment he was standing up full height, a magnificent but most unwelcome sight. There was a thin line of froth along the half-opened mouth, the deep-set eyes glared out under the eyebrows, and forehead bunched into frowning wrinkles, as for a few seconds he leaned forwards like a lion about to spring, and scanned the men and oxen before him. And then, as they watched him in breathless silence, he sprang lightly off the waggon, picked up a small dry stick as he landed, and ran up along the span. He spoke to the after ox by name as he passed, called to another and touched it into place, thrust his way between the next one and the dazed white man standing near it, tossing him aside with a brush of his arm, as a ploughshare spurns a sod, and then they saw how the boy's madness had taken him. His work and his span had called to him in his delirium, and he had answered. With low mutterings, short words hissed out, and all the sounds and terms the cattle knew shot at them, low-pitched and with intense repression. He ran along the span, crouching low all the time, like a savage stealing up for a murderous attack. The two white men stood back and watched. Reaching the front oxen, he grasped the leading rheim, and pulled them round until they stood level for the straight pull-out. Then down the other side of the span he ran with cat-like tread and activity, talking to each and straightening them up as he had done with the others. And when he reached the waggon again, he turned sharply and overlooked the span. One ox had swung round and stood out of line. There was a pause of seconds, and then the big Zulu called the ox by name, not loudly, but in a deep, low tone, husky with intensity, and the animal swung back into line again. Then, out of the silence that followed, came an electrifying yell to the span. Every bullock leaned into its yoke, and the waggon went out with a rush. And he drove them at a half-trot all the way to the store, without water, without help, without consciousness, the little dry twig still in his hands, and only his masterful intensity and knowledge of his work and span to see him through. "A mad, troublesome savage," said Harry Williams, "but one of the very best. Anyhow, we thought so. He saved us." There was something very familiar in this, and it was with a queer feeling of pride and excitement that I asked, "Did he ever say to you, 'Me catch 'em lion live'?" "By gum! You know him! Jim McCoquel!" "Indeed I do. Good old Jim." Years afterwards Jim was still a driver, working when necessary, fighting when possible, and enjoying intervals of lordly ease at his kraal, where his wives and cattle stayed and prospered. End of chapter 26.
Chapter 27 of Jock of the Bushveld by Sir Percy Fitzpatrick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sally McConnell in Betty's Bay, South Africa, in March 2010. Chapter 27. His Duty. And Jock? But I never saw my dog again. For a year or so he lived something of the old veld life, trekking and hunting. From time to time I heard of him from Ted and others. Stories seemed to gather easily about him as they do about certain people, and many knew Jock and were glad to bring news of him. The things they thought wonderful and admirable made pleasant news for them to tell, and welcome news to me, and they were heard with contented pride, but without surprise, as, just like him, there was nothing more to be said. One day I received word from Ted that he was off to Scotland for a few months, and had left Jock with another old friend, Tom Barnett. Tom, at whose store under the big fig-tree Seedling lies buried. And although I was glad that he'd been left with a good friend like Tom, who would care for him as well as anyone could, the life there was not of the kind to suit him. For a few months it would not matter, but I had no idea of letting him end his days as a watchdog at a trader's store in the Kaffir country. Tom's trouble was with thieves, for the natives about there were not a good lot, and their dogs were worse. when Jock saw or scented him they had the poorest sort of luck or chance, he fought to kill, and not as town dogs fight. He had learnt his work in a hard school, and he never stopped or slackened until the work was done. So his fame soon spread, and it brought Tom more peace than he had enjoyed for many a day. Natives no longer wandered at will into the reed-enclosed yard. Kaffir dogs ceased to sneak into the store and through the house, stealing everything they could get. Jock took up his place at the door, and hungry mongrels watched him from a distance, or sneaked up a little closer when from time to time he trotted round to the yard at the back of the building to see how things were going there. All was well enough during the day, but the trouble occurred at night. The Kaffirs were too scared to risk being caught by him, but the dogs from the surrounding kraals prowled about after dark, scavenging and thieving where they could, and what angered Tom most of all was the killing of his fowls. The yard at the back of the store was enclosed by a fence of close-packed reeds, and in the middle of the yard stood the old fowl-house with a clear space of bare ground all round it. On many occasions Kaffir dogs had found their way through the reed fence and killed fowls perching about the yard, and several times they had burgled the fowl-house itself. In spite of Jock's presence and reputation, this night robbing still continued, for while he slept peacefully in front of the store, the robbers would do their work at the back. Poor old fellow! They were many, and he was one. They prowled night and day, and he had to sleep sometimes. They were watchful, and he was deaf, so he had no chance at all unless he saw or scented them. There were 2 small windows looking out onto the yard, but no door in the back of the building. Thus, in order to get into the yard, it was necessary to go out of the front door and round the side of the house. On many occasions Tom, roused by the screaming of the fowls, had seized his gun and run round to get a shot at the thieves, but the time so lost was enough for a Kaffir dog, and the noise made in opening the reed gate gave ample warning of his coming. The result was that Tom generally had all his trouble for nothing, but it was not always so. Several times he roused Jock as he ran out, and invariably got some satisfaction out of what followed. Once Jock caught one of the thieves struggling to force a way through the fence, and held on to the hind leg till Tom came up with his gun. On other occasions he had caught them in the yard. On others again he had run them down in the bush and finished it off there without help or hindrance. That was the kind of life to which Jock seemed to have settled down. He was then in the very prime of life, and I still hoped to get him back to me some day, to a home where he would end his days in peace. Yet it seemed impossible to picture him in a life of ease and idleness. A watchdog in a house, sleeping away his life on a mat, his only excitement keeping off strange Kaffirs and stray dogs, or burrowing for rats and moles in a garden with old age, deafness, and infirmities growing year by year to make his end miserable. I had often thought that it might have been better that he died fighting, hanging on with his indomitable pluck and tenacity, tackling something with all the odds against him, doing his duty and his best as he had always done, and died as Rocky's dog had died. If, on that last day of our hunting together, he had got at the lioness and gone under in the hopeless fight, if the sable bull had caught him and finished him with one of the scythe-like sweeps of the scimitar horns, if he could have died like Nelson in the hour of victory, would it not have been better for him, happier for me? I often thought so. For to fade away slowly, to lose his strength and fire and intelligence, to outlive his character and no longer be himself, no, that could not be happiness. Well, Jock is dead. Jock, the innocent cause of seedlings' downfall and death, lies buried under the same big fig tree. The graves stand side by side. He died as he lived, true to his trust, and this is how it happened, as it was faithfully told to me. It was a bright moonlight night. Think of the scores we had spent together, the mild, glorious nights of the Bushveld. And once more Tom was roused by a clatter of falling boxes and the wild screams of fowls in the yard. Only the night before the thieves had beaten him again, but this time he was determined to be even with them. Jumping out of bed, he opened the little window looking out onto the fowl-house, and with his gun resting on the sill waited for the thief. He waited long and patiently, and by the screaming of the fowls subsided enough for him to hear the gurgling and scratching about in the fowl house, and he settled down to a still longer watch. Evidently the Kaffer dog was enjoying his stolen meal in there. "Go on, finish it," Tom muttered grimly. "I'll have you this time if I wait till morning." So he stood at the window waiting and watching, until every sound had died away outside. He listened intently. There was not a stir. There was nothing to be seen in the moonlit yard, nothing to be heard, not even a breath of air to rustle the leaves in the big fig tree. Then, in the same dead stillness, the dim form of a dog appeared in the doorway, stepping softly out of the fowl house, and stood in the deep shadow of the little porch. Tom lifted the gun slowly and took careful aim. When the smoke cleared away, the figure of the dog lay still, stretched out on the ground where it had stood, and Tom went back to bed, satisfied. The morning sun slanting across the yard shone in Tom's eyes as he pushed the reed gate open and made his way towards the fowl house. Under the porch, where the sunlight touched it, something shone like burnished gold. He was stretched on his side. It might have been in sleep, but on the snow-white chest there was one red spot. And inside the fowl house lay the Kaffer dog, dead. Jock had done his duty. End of chapter 27. Notes and Glossary of Jock of the Bushveld by Sir Percy Fitzpatrick. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please contact LibriVox.org. Read by Sally McConnell in Betty's Bay, South Africa, in March 2010. Notes. Snake stories are proverbially an uncommercial risk for those who value a reputation for truthfulness. Hailstorms are scarcely less disastrous, hence these notes. Mamba. This is believed to be the largest and swiftest of the deadly snakes, and one of the most wantonly vicious. The late Dr. Kalenzo, Bishop of Zululand, in his Zulu Directory, describes them as attaining a length of 12 feet and capable of chasing a man on horseback. The writer has seen several of this length, and has heard of measurements up to 14 feet, which, however, were not sufficiently verified. He has also often heard stories of men on horseback being chased by black mambas, but has never met the man himself, nor succeeded in eliciting the important facts as to pace and distance. However that may be, the movements of a mamba, even on open ground, are, as the writer has several times observed, so incredibly swift as to leave no other impression on the mind than that of having witnessed a magical disappearance. How often and how far they travel on their tails, whether it is a continuous movement or merely a momentary uprising to command a view, and what length or what proportion of the body is on the ground for support or propulsion, the writer has no means of knowing. During the Zulu War an imperial officer was bitten by a mamba while on horseback, and died immediately. Hailstorms. Bad hailstorms occur every year in South Africa, but they do not last long. 10 minutes is enough to destroy everything that stands. The distances are immense, and the area of disturbance is usually a narrow strip. Hence, except when one strikes a town, very few people ever witness them. This summer hailstorms were more general and more severe in the Transvaal than for some time past. A bad storm baffles description. The size of the hailstones is only one of the factors. A strong wind enormously increases the destructiveness, yet some idea may be gathered from the size of the stones. The writer took a plaster cast of one picked up at Suurfontein, near Johannesburg, in November 1906, which measured 4½ inches long, 3½ wide, and 1 1/8 inches thick, a slab of white ice. In the Hekpoort Valley near Johannesburg, and in Barberton about the same date, the veld was like a glacier. The hail lay like snow, inches deep, and during the worst spells the general run of hailstones varied in size from pigeon eggs to hen's eggs. But the big ones, the crash of whose individual blows was distinctly heard through the general roar, are described as bigger than cricket balls, and the size of breakfast cups, generally with an elongation or tail like a balloon. Sheep and buck were killed, and full-grown cattle so battered that some were useless and others died of the injuries. Wooden doors were broken in, the panels being completely shattered. Corrugated iron roofs were perforated, and in some cases the hailstones drove completely through them. The writer photographed a portion of a roof in Barberton which had suffered thus, and saw plaster casts formed by pouring plaster of Paris into the indentations which 2 hailstorms had made in a flower bed, in diameter equalling respectively tennis and cricket balls. Near Harrismith, O.R.C., in 1903, 2 herd boys with a troop of about 100 goats and calves were caught by the hail. The boys and all the stock, except 1 old goat, were killed. Glossary. Note: the spelling of Cape Dutch and native names is in many cases not to be determined by recognized authority. The pronunciation cannot be quite accurately suggested through the medium of English. The figures of weights and measurements of animals are gathered from many sources and refer only to first-class specimens. The weights are necessarily approximate. Aasvoël, Dutch. Literary meaning carrion bird. Antbeer, aardvark, Dutch. Orycterapus afer. Ant heap, mound made by termites or white ants, usually formed by one colony of ants, about 2 to 4 feet in base diameter and height, but often in certain localities very much larger. The writer photographed one this year near the scene of the last hunt, 18 feet base diameter and 10 feet high, and another in Rhodesia which formed a complete background for a travelling wagonette and 6 mules. In both cases these mounds were deserted cities, and trees, probably 50 to 100 years old, were growing out of them. Assegai, native. Native spear. Baas, Dutch. Master. Bonsella, native. A present. Beker, Dutch. A cup. Billy, a small tin utensil with lid and handle used for boiling water. Bucksail, tarpaulin used for covering transport wagons, which are known as buck wagons. Buffalo, Cape buffalo. Boskafer, height 5 foot 6 inches, weight possibly 1,000 pounds. Horns 48 inches from tip to tip, and 36 inches in length on curve. Biltong, Dutch. Meat cut in strips, slightly salted and dried in the open air. Bushbuck, a medium-sized but very courageous antelope. Tragelaphus scriptus, height 3 feet, weight 130 pounds, horns, males only, 18 inches. Bushveld, Dutch. Bush country, also called lowveld and low country. Cane rat, Thryonomus swinderenianus. Shaka, native. The first of the great Zulu kings and founder of the Zulu military power. Dussie, Dutch. Rock rabbit. Coney, Procavia hyrax capensis. Literary meaning little badger. Dingaan, Dingaan, native. The second of the great Zulu kings, brother, murderer, and successor of Shaka. Disselboom, Dutch. The pole of a vehicle. Donga, native. A gully or dry watercourse with steep banks. Doughboys, scones, frequently unleavened dough baked in coals, also ash cakes, roaster cookies, stick in the gizzards, felt bricks, and so on. Drift, Dutch, a ford. Duiker, Dutch, a small antelope found throughout Africa. Cephalopus grimi, gross weight 30 to 40 pounds, height 28 inches, horns 5½ inches. Literary meaning, diver, so called from its habit of disappearing and reappearing in low scrub in a succession of bounds when it first starts running. Go-way bird, the grey plantain eater, Schizorbis concolor. Hartebeest, Dutch, a large antelope of which there are several varieties, varying in gross weight from 300 to 500 pounds. Height 48 inches, horns 24 inches. Highveld, Dutch, high country, the plateau, about 5,000 to 6,000 feet above sea level. Honeybird, the honey guide, several species, family Indicatoridae. Honeysucker, sunbird, several species, family Nectarinidae. Horse sickness, a lung infection prevalent during summer in low-lying parts, generally fatal, caused by microbes introduced in the blood by some insect. Impala, native, an antelope, Apiciurus melampus. Habitat Bushveld, weight 140 pounds, horns up to 20 inches, straight. Impi, native, an army or body of armed natives gathered for or engaged in war. Induna, native, a headman, captain or chief, great or petty. Inkoos, native, chief, used as a term of respect in address or salutation. Inspan, Dutch, to yoke up, harness up, or hitch up. Isandlwana, meaning the little hand, the hill which gave the name to the battle in which the 24th Regiment was annihilated in the Zulu War, 1879. Kaffercorn, sorghum. Kahle, native, gently, carefully, pleasantly, well. Hambagahle, farewell, go in peace. Hlalagahle, farewell, stay in peace. Kehla, native, a native of certain age and position entitled to wear the head ring. Dutch ringkop, ring head. Kerry or kiri, native sticks used for fighting, frequently knobbed, hence knobkerry. Ketchawayo, fourth and last of the great Zulu kings. Klipspringer, Dutch, a small antelope, in appearance and habit rather like chamois. Oreotragus saltator, literally meaning a rock jumper. Kloof, Dutch, a gorge. Knee halter, Dutch, to couple the head to one foreleg by a rim or strap attached to the halter, closely enough to prevent the animal from moving fast. Koran, Dutch, the smaller bustard. Literary meaning, scolding cock. Kudu, Strepsiceros capensis. Habitat, rugged bushy country. Height 5 feet, weight 600 pounds. Horns up to 48 inches straight and 66 inches on curve. Koppie, Dutch, a hill. Literary meaning, a little head. Kraal, Dutch, an enclosure for cattle, sheep, etc. A corral, also a collection of native huts, the home of a family, the village of a chief or tribe. Krantz, German, a precipitous face or coronet of rock on a hill or mountain. Leguaan, a huge water lizard, the monitor. Cape Dutch, maximum length up to 8 feet. Loper, round shot for fowling piece, about 4 times the size of buckshot. Marula, in Zulu umgano, a tree which furnishes soft white wood which is carved into bowls, spoons, etc. Fruit eaten or fermented for drink. Sclerocarya cafra. Meerkat, Dutch. A small animal of the mongoose kind, properly applied to Sericata tetradactyla, but loosely to several species. Middelveld, Dutch. The mixed country lying between the Highveld and the Bushveld. Nekstrop, Dutch. The neck strap or rim which, attached to the yoke scales, keep the yoke in place. Nix, Dutch. Nothing. Oribi, native. A small antelope. Oribia scaparia. Weight 30 pounds. Height 24 inches. Horns 6 inches. Outspan, Dutch. To unyoke or unharness. Also the camp where one has outspanned, and places where it is customary or by law permitted to outspan. Panda, properly Mpande, native, the third of the great Zulu kings. Partridge, pheasant. Names applied somewhat loosely to various species of francolin. Pauw, Dutch, the great bustard. Literary meaning, peacock. Pezulu, native, on top, up, above. Poort, Dutch, a gap or gorge in a range of hills. Literary meaning, gate. Quagga, zebra. Correctly applied to Equus quagga, now extinct, but still applied to the various species of zebra found in South Africa. Riem, Dutch, a stout strip of rawhide. Rimpie, Dutch, a small riem. Ritbak, Dutch, reedbuck. Curvy capra arrondinum. Height 3 foot 6 inches. Gross weight 140 pounds. Horns male only, up to 16 inches. Sable antelope. Hippotragus niger. Dutch, swart witpens. Habitat Bushveld. Height 4 foot 6 inches. Weight 350 pounds. Horns up to 48 inches on curve. Sagabona, native. Zulu equivalent of good day. Salted horse. One which has had horse sickness, and is thus considered immune, as in smallpox. Hence, salted is freely used colloquially as meaning acclimatized, tough, hardened, etc. Sconce, Dutch. A stone or earth breastwork for defence, very common in old native wars. Skellum, Dutch. A rascal, like Scotch skellum. Skerm, Dutch. A protection of bush or trees, usually against wild animals. Sjambok, Dutch. Tapering rawhide whip made from rhinoceros, hippopotamus, or giraffe skin. Skay, a yoke skay, short for Dutch jukskay. Sloot, Dutch. A ditch. Span, Dutch. A team. Spoor, Dutch. Footprints, also a trail of man, animal, or vehicle. Springbuck, Dutch. A small antelope. Antidorcus gazella ucore. Habitat, Highveld and other open grass country. Height 30 inches. Weight up to 90 pounds. Horns 19 inches. Literary meaning, jumping buck. Spruit, Dutch. A stream. Squirrel or tree rat. Native name Mshinand, Phanisciorus palliatus. Stembuck, Dutch. A small antelope. Rhaphicaris campistiae. Height 22 inches. Weight 25 pounds. Horns 5 inches. Stoep, Dutch. A raised promenade or paved veranda in front or at sides of a house. Tambuki grass. Native. A very rank grass, in places reaches 15 feet high and stem diameter 1/2 inch. Tick or rhinoceros bird, the oxpecker. Bulphaga africana. Tiger. In South Africa the leopard is generally called a tiger, first so described by the Dutch. Toktoki. A slow-moving beetle incapable of flight. Gets its name from its means of signalling by rapping the abdomen on the ground. Tenebrianid beetle, of the genus Samides. Trek, Dutch. Literary meaning, to pull. To move off or go on a journey. A journey, an expedition. For example, the Great Trek, or exodus of Boers from the Cape Colony, 1836 to 1848. Also, and commonly, the time, distance, or journey from one outspan to another. Trek gear. The traction gear, chain, yokes, etc. of a wagon. The Boer pioneers had no chains and used rims plaited into a stout rope, hence trek tow or pulling rope. Sesame. An antelope, one of the hartebeest family. Damaliscus lunatus. Dutch, bastard hartebeest. Height 48 inches, weight 300 pounds, horns 15 inches. Tsetse fly. A grey fly little larger than the common housefly, whose bite is fatal to domesticated animals. Twiggle. Little people's word for the excited movement of a small dog's tail, believed to be a combination of wriggle and twiddle. Mfaan. Native, a boy. Mganam. Native, my friend. Umlung. Native. The native word to describe a white man. Veld. Dutch. The open or unoccupied country, uncultivated or grazing land. Vlei. Dutch. A small shallow lake, a swamp, a depression intermittently damp, a water meadow. Voorloper. Literary meaning, front walker. The leader, the boy who leads the front oxen. The Patentambo, Zulu for take the rim. Voorslag. Dutch. Literary meaning, front lash or skin. The strip of buck hide, which forms the fine end of a whiplash. Waterbuck. Cobus ellipsiprimnus. Dutch. Krunggat. Height 48 inches, weight 350 pounds, horns, males only, 36 inches. Wildebeest. Dutch. Literary meaning, wild cattle. The bridled gnu, blue wildebeest, Conocytes taurinus. Height 4 foot 6 inches, weight 400 pounds, horns 30 inches. Wild dog. The Cape hunting dog. Lycaon pictus. Wooden orange. Fruit of the klapper, a species of strychnos. Wolf. The usual name for the hyena, derived from tiger wolf, the pure Dutch name for the spotted hyena. Yokeskei. The wooden slat which, coupled by neck strops, holds the yoke in place. End of Glossary. The end of Jock of the Bushveld.